Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kristiane Huber with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Pursuing Resilient Economies and Climate-Prepared Communities. Today, our presenters will be talking about opportunities to consider economic development objectives and resilience planning, and how to ensure local economies are climate resilient. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit of background about C2ES. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our mission is to forge practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, expand clean energy, and strengthen resilience to climate impacts. And to do that, we bring together city, state, and national policymakers together with businesses and other stakeholders. Some further background on our resilience program is that we work with communities at various stages in developing their resilience strategy. This is a series of briefs that we wrote last year about strategies for cities to prepare for different climate impacts, and that included cost and benefit strategies where that was available. And then we also do some work on corporate resilience. Since our 2013 report titled Weathering the Storm, we've been looking at how companies talk about risk from climate impacts or physical risks. In 2018, we analyzed financial disclosures from FY 2016 to see how climate risk was discussed, to compare it to these two reports from 2013 and 2015. And I'll present those findings momentarily. I also just want to draw your attention to a couple of our newer resources. They provide some background on some of what we'll be discussing today. Our first one is a primer on what resilience is, which includes some definitions of resilience jargon, which you'll probably hear some of today. And the other is an overview of climate-related business risks, opportunities, and leadership to give a little more background on what businesses are thinking about some of the questions we'll be talking about today and about climate risk and resilience in general. So some of the findings of our Weathering the Storm update that we did in 2018 are shown here. We looked at the same 100 companies, but in 2016 or /2018, we were only looking at 98 because of mergers. And those are the same companies that we've been following since our first report. We looked at their CDP survey responses, financial reporting, and sustainability reporting for mentions of how climate risk affects their business and their bottom line. And in 2016, we found that 96 of the 98 companies we looked at mentioned physical risk in one of their reports. And we see this increase in reporting of physical risks across the documents, as you can see in the graphic. And it demonstrates that climate risk is increasingly on the private sector's mind. This next graphic shows the same numbers, but also shows some of that breakdown between the multiple documents and the overlap. So in fiscal year 2016, a greater number of companies disclosed in multiple reports, with one quarter mentioning climate risk in all three of these kinds of financial disclosures. We also saw an especially large increase in financial reporting to the SEC mentioning climate risk, really speaking to this question of resilience and climate risk not only being in the sustainability department and environmental social governance, but really more a matter of businesses remaining profitable and viable. So to continue that research and really relate it to the community work that we've been doing, we have started a new research project. As we've worked with cities who are trying to learn more about their business community's concerns, and have worked with businesses that are managing and limiting exposure to climate risks, we have been wondering about how these two approaches are lining up. So in our new research, we ask, are cities considering climate vulnerabilities as they could impact the ability to attract people, investment, and businesses? How are credit rating agencies, insurance companies, real estate, and broader finance considering and integrating climate risk into their decisions that affect cities? And how will they be doing this in the future? Is there an alignment or a gap between how cities and the private sector are thinking about this question of competitiveness as it relates to climate change? And this is all to answer the overarching question of how can cities and companies ensure competitiveness in a changing climate? We are in the course of doing a number of interviews with cities, and we'll be turning to interviews more with finance and insurance experts soon. But if anyone on the line is interested in this research and would want to participate or provide any input, you can email me, and my email will be at the end of the presentation. So with that bit of background, I would like to introduce our speakers today. First, we'll be hearing from Mark Hartman, the City of Phoenix's Chief Sustainability Officer, and he's been in that role for 5 years. Next up, we'll have Meg Arnold from Sacramento, California. She is a principal for GSD Consulting and works with Valley Vision, which is an organization in Sacramento. She's focused on the clean economy and innovation and entrepreneurship initiatives. And she's also part of the Cleaner Air Partnership, and she is vice chair of the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative. Lastly, bringing a more regional perspective from the Gulf Coast, Scott Hemmerling is the Director of Human Dimensions at the Water Institute of the Gulf. His research focuses on climate adaptation and community resilience, and he'll be sharing some of that perspective towards the end of our session today. After all of our presenters have spoken, we will have some time for questions, so please submit your questions in the questions box in the GoToWebinar program. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but really welcome your participation through the asking of questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark.
Sure, great. Well, hello everyone. Yeah, I'll kick off this talking about City Phoenix, and really, and as I speak about Phoenix, it's really true in conversations that many cities are these very same things that I'm mentioning are true of cities around the globe. I just got back from the European Commission. There were a number of us that traveled to 4 European cities that were green capitals, and it was interesting how similar a lot of the messaging compared to US cities was very similar, and some of the things they're doing pretty exciting, probably more aggressive than we're doing, but still really interesting. And so, and I think the conversation is really changing. I think sustainability has really focused originally on environmental sustainability, and they're really recognizing the importance of social and economic sustainability as being cornerstones. It's always been known that sustainability kind of covered those 3 pillars, but a lot of climate plans and things were all very much focusing on environmental and recognizing the importance of integrating both economic and social attributes, and you'll see as I talk about it in this presentation. So on the next slide, I want to give a sort of a definition of sustainability, and if it changes over, you'll see it. That slide is really that, I think it's here, it's coming. Yes, it comes, great. And it's improving quality of life. And that's what we're talking about. It's not just clean air, clean water, and healthy ecosystems, but also great education systems and great justice systems, and a strong economy and lots of jobs and job training. And so really looking at that, and it's a quality of life for all. It's not just some neighborhoods or some part of the communities, but actually for everyone. And so that's really what we're talking about for sustainability, and sort of the bit we're adding at the end is this: is there a way to do that with all of our science and all our ingenuity and cleverness? Can we actually make nature better off as a result of being on this planet? So currently we're degrading Earth systems, but is there a way to actually make those thrive? And so that's really the context of a sustainability definition as we go forward. And so, and I want to talk about now, next slide, I think I need the prompts on what these slides will be so I can introduce them. But cities around the globe, as I've said, are kind of considering some of these this is over 9,000 cities that are global covenant of mayors that have committed to the Paris Agreement. So that's a 30% reduction in carbon by 2025, but also many other bold actions. And it's pretty inspiring as we talk amongst one another what cities are doing in terms of in all things, and some pretty ambitious targets around the globe, and not just the West or even Europe, but also Asia and South America and Africa. Some really bold actions that these cities are taking, and pretty exciting. And so next slide. And yeah, so I can't really remember what's on each of these slides by this order because it's unique for this one, but I think the summary that businesses have really said is that businesses are choosing sustainable cities. That's where they want to locate. They're really seeing that message. At first, probably a little over a decade ago, the general view of cities was, oh, we're all going to die. We'll never turn this Earth ship fast enough. It's just really discouraging. And where the global oil companies dominated the stock markets and were really where a lot of the investment was, the top were the top operated the top 5 positions on the sort of market capital. And today, even just a couple tech companies, Apple and Google, represent more than all global oil companies combined. It's really a changing story. And what they're seeing, it's really been a windfall for cities that have been thinking about sustainability. The New York, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, where businesses are saying, look, we want to locate our business, we want to bring our people to the cities that are actually thinking about how to make a great quality of life. The mayor of Oklahoma City has, one of his stories is as he described wanting to attract a major airline to their city. And we're really excited. They engaged everyone about this airline and bringing thousands of jobs to their city. And they actually, on announcement day, were shocked when they weren't chosen. And they said, why didn't you choose us? And they said, well, we did a mystery shop, and your city is a dump. Like your downtown washes are full of garbage. It's really not a great environment. We didn't want to bring employees to your city who really won't have, we want to have places where they can be outdoors and exercise and bike and do these things, because we can attract businesses and attract millennials. We want to be in these cities. And so that was a real call for them. In Oklahoma City today, they really completely revitalized their downtown, and that once garbage-filled wash is now a vibrant canal that actually you can go with walking paths and biking paths along it. So really changing how businesses think about that. But also, as we next slide, as we go on our next button here, global investors are choosing, are really wanting to see that investment. If they're going to invest both in businesses and in cities, they really want to see that they're thinking the long term, that they're thinking about these things that are of value, that divesting from things that are actually going to be a negative for those cities and investing in the things that will really make a difference. And so it's interesting, Moody's now, they're actually, as they go out and give ratings to cities, they're actually including adaptation and resilience in their actual rankings. They actually have questionnaires going out to those businesses and asking them, what are you doing? And you can imagine a city, so Phoenix itself, we're doing $1 billion bond issue this year. That credit ratings, in other words, interest rates that you can borrow at, will make a really big difference in what that can mean. So you can imagine a typical city might have a couple $100 million bond, and even just a 1-point difference or 0.1% difference in interest rate can mean tens of millions of dollars over the borrowing period. So really important thinking about those. And even in, it's interesting, our director of finance was, through encouragement, encouraging her to look at some of these things, was actually looking at green bonds for some of our projects, so some of our greener projects, and finding a 6-point difference between green bonds and regular bonds. So actually becoming better pricing. And so that 6-point difference could mean significant in millions of dollars of savings. And traditionally, our finance director's answer was, oh, we don't really want to do this because it's so much work to report all this and track all this. And I said, look, if you've got $10 million, that can buy a lot of people to do your reporting and do other stuff as well. So certainly, she's much more amenable now in recognizing this market advance of doing that. And even in some of our short-term investments, investing in some of the green-rated investments are actually some pretty good returns that are happening on those. So next slide. And you think of what is the investment to do that, and how much funding it takes. Just click through this slide. Is that where does all this funding come from? These stacks of money that are needed, and even just the city of Phoenix. So this isn't state or federal funding. This is just the city's budget between now and 2050. That would are our long-term goals. Our capital budgets are $200 billion, or city budgets around the U.S. is $40 trillion. So can we achieve some of these outcomes? Can we do this with $40 trillion? We don't have more than that. That's all we have. It's $40 trillion to deliver some of these sustainability outcomes at the same time. And then you think of what investments businesses have alongside that, or even state and federal government. So it's pretty significant, the kind of investment that's available to us to just think differently and not be so wasteful as we go through these processes. So next slide. And yeah, so investment's pretty significant. So talking specifically about climate risk, you know, as cities are thinking about that in Phoenix, it's 21 degrees hotter kind of in city versus rural areas during, as a result of everything done in the early evening. So sometimes a surrounding desert can even be hotter during the day than the city itself, but it lets off that heat very quickly in the evenings while the city keeps holding on to it. And so, so yeah, it can be significantly hotter. So how do we cool our cities and actually make it great? I mean, as a hot city, people wonder, how do you do that, those kind of temperatures? But actually we have been thinking about it a long time, but even it's actually been, really haven't thought as much about vulnerable populations, and that's really where the change is happening, of really, how do we create cool corridors within our city that actually people can walk through and actually move about the city. So we don't need to actually create and put shade of our entire city, just where the people are and where the people move. And so there's real opportunity to do that. Next slide. And you know, why heat's important, and actually I've seen sort of stories from around the US in the last couple of days. It's starting to heat up. You know, it really is, as cities think about this, you know, even the green cities around the US, they certainly wonder what's happening with public health. There were 175 deaths last year in Phoenix as a result of heat, or in the county, surrounding county, and over 4,000 hospital visits. And you think, what is the cost of that to a society that is not addressing or focusing on some of these things? And what do they do that? So what those thousands of hospital visits? Last year, our state spent $35 billion on healthcare. And if even 1% of that is health related to heat, that'd be $350 million we're spending. And so figure thousands of people, and what is the cost, and even time related off work and those types of things. In particular, it affects people that are outdoor workers or people that are experiencing homelessness. What that is like for them. So really addressing and being much more deliberate than we have, and other cities are very focusing on us than they have in the past. And even in the economic viability, as businesses are thinking of locating, they want to know that these things are in place, and cities are thinking about that before considering relocating to those cities. So next slide. So our plan, and actually you'll see something similar to others, is really looking at creating a urban heat. We have council approval this just a couple of weeks ago to create an urban heat mitigation and adaptation plan throughout our city, to kind of look at what are we going to do in the long term, what things are we going to do to engage our community, both actions. As a city, we've been thinking about it a long time. We have a whole potpourri of actions that we've taken, but really no comprehensive citywide plan to just cool the city down over time. And so we're really looking at how to go, and we're partnering with a university, Arizona State University, to do that. And it's interesting in going out to the community, going out to businesses and asking businesses. We actually said to them, you know what, some of our business community, we actually had 50 different businesses in the room, and said to them, what kind of things would you want us to do? And the businesses said, well, actually, you can make it not so hard for us to put shade outside of our business. Like, it's really, you add all these really permits, and it's really difficult, and we need to get variances. Like, if we want to do shade, don't you want us to do that? So really kind of changing that. And then the second one there is just heat ready certification, to make sure the city is what it is to be heat ready. Many cities are storm ready, over 2,200 cities, and verified by the National Weather Service to say what it is to be storm ready, but it hasn't really been classified. What is it for city to be heat ready? So we're looking at defining that, and other cities are really looking forward to us kind of coming out with what that would look like, so that they can adopt that as well. I'm specifically focused on heat, particularly because, you know, the heat-related deaths in the U.S., there's more of heat-related than all other natural disasters combined. So all the other climate-related disasters. So you think of hurricanes and storms and flooding, and all the deaths related to that aren't as many as what are heat. So it's a really important thing for cities to focus on, and a very important priority. And the last slide, just to kind of give an overall perspective of what a framework might look like for sustainability, sort of as I was kind of introduced. And so from resilience, certainly be storm ready and heat ready and drought ready, kind of look at these things as a city. But this context of that, economic sustainability, to kind of be how is your workforce ready, and how are you training and enabling small businesses, and the transportation choices to make it easy for their employees to get around. And then the social sustainability really looking at education and civil and human rights and safe communities to really make sure that we're thinking about those things as well. And then on the right was the environmental, which are more the traditional, zero waste, climate ready, which are really cool things as well. But also, they all need to be thought of in composites. So that's kind of the framework that we're thinking of as a city, and that many cities. I mean, it's our framework, but you'll see this actually replicated in many cities throughout the U.S. and throughout the globe. So that's kind of the introduction and framework, and I'd be happy to now pass it over to Meg to kind of talk about it.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mark. Shall I just jump in, Kristiane? I will just jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. And yeah, Meg, you can take over.
Okay. Can we jump to my first slide, please? There we go. Great. So my name is Meg Arnold, and I am apparently, according to the date on my cover slide, I'm speaking to you from 2 days in the future, which I guess would make it Saturday. So that's my error. But I'm based in Sacramento, California, and I am a principal with a consulting firm called GSD Consulting, and do a fair bit of work in the greater Sacramento region, and some additional work nationally and throughout the state. Can we go to the next slide? I want to talk to you a little bit today about California's capital region, just give you a sense of what it is, where it is, what it's like, some of the risks that we are vulnerable to and at risk of, and then share with you a framework that I've been working with to think about different ways, different degrees of integrating climate change action and resilience with economic development strategies, whether at a city or a regional scale. So California's capital region consists of the 6 counties surrounding the capital city, Sacramento, where it's home to about 2.5 million people in 22 city and county jurisdictions. On the map that you see on the left of the screen there, that comes from the state's 4th climate assessment map, and that entire region bounded in red in a larger part of the map is what the 4th climate assessment calls the Sacramento Valley. The 6 counties of the capital region are at the very southern end of that part of the map. The 2.5 million population in those 6 counties is now majority minority. You can see some of the breakdowns on the screen. And interestingly, a friend of mine who's leading the census for Sacramento County noted to me that Sacramento County is actually the most language diverse in the state of California, which means that we've got 17 languages, each of which is spoken by more than 2% of the population, which is a threshold measure for census work. So it's a fairly diverse population, and it's an increasingly diverse population. And we have also come to be able to quantify some of the inequalities that we have been seeing in our region over the last years. About a year ago, a number of regional partners retained the Brookings Institution to come in and do an assessment, a metropolitan area assessment of our region, and particularly from the perspective of how best to create a more inclusive economy. And some of the measures of inequity that exist in our region are here on the slide. 34% of more than a third of all families struggle economically. And the Brookings measure of that is what they define as struggling, has to do with the degree to which one's household income exceeds one's necessary household expenses. So for 34% of families, that's not always the case. And that's particularly true for those without high school degrees, and particularly for African American and Latino households, where 66% without high school degrees and 47 and 42% respectively of African American and Latino families struggle economically. So next slide, please. That's a bit about who we are. I also want to tell you a little bit about the regional climate risks that we are vulnerable to. It was a great segue from Mark, because we are also vulnerable to heat and to extreme and extended heat. In fact, by 2100, we'll be, summer-wise, we will be much more like Tucson than we are like ourselves today. And Mark also mentioned economic impact of heat. And one of the facts that we include when we talk about heat in our region is that a study from, I think it was 2017, found that there is an expected 4% annual decline in regional economic output for any region for any 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, which is a pretty significant overall impact, and particularly because the Sacramento, the capital region, is at the center of a pretty intense agricultural region for our nation and the world, frankly, with a significant degree, therefore, of outdoor employees. But it's not just heat. We also get to be at risk of flood. A number of folks who work in flood and water in our region note that we are at the highest risk level for flood in the nation outside of Louisiana, like southern Louisiana. We have a great deal of levee work along our rivers. And then the severe storms that we see in the winter that are called atmospheric rivers are, as with most kinds of storms, becoming more frequent and severe. But not only do we get to suffer from too much water, we also get to suffer from not enough water. We came out of California-wide a multi-year drought just in 2017, and an economic analysis from UC Davis found that in 2015, the economic impact of the drought was almost $2 billion and more than 10,000 jobs that had gone. And also, as everyone in the country is aware, California, and our region is no exception, is really vulnerable to wildfire. Our Sierra Nevada and Sierra Nevada foothill communities are most significantly at risk in our region, and we also suffer from wildfire smoke air quality crises, such as the Camp Fire, which was a 2-week duration of either hazardous or extremely hazardous air quality throughout the region and, frankly, much of the state. So that's the climate, literally, in which we get to operate. Despite all that, it's actually a fabulous part of the country. So if we can go to the next slide. Given all of that, one of the things that we were interested in exploring, and this is through one of my clients, Valley Vision, which conducts public opinion polls on a number of different topics of regional interest. But we looked at what regional residents think about climate change. And this is just this slide and the next really quick snapshots of some of the data. There's a URL at the bottom of this page that you can go to see the full range of results if you're interested. Almost 90% of our residents believe that humans have contributed to climate change. And I'll stop there and say we are both a very blue and also a very red region overall in different parts of our geography. But overall, 88% of residents believe humans have contributed to climate change, and 70% believe that they are already beginning to see the effects of climate change in their daily lives. Almost 80% think that their community is at very or extremely serious risk for at least one climate change risk that we'd itemized. More than 90% believe that at least one of these risks has already been a major issue for their family. I will stop there and say we had this poll in the field immediately after the Camp Fire wildfire smoke air quality crisis, so it was top of people's minds. And more than 60% are very or extremely concerned about how climate change will affect the well-being of future generations. So that was sort of just a set of grounding questions that we asked. We also, on the next slide, please, asked about how people feel about the interplay between climate and the economy, both from a risk perspective and also in terms of the impact on jobs. So on the risk side, which you see on the left side of the screen, 69% of respondents feel that that climate change is either a very serious or somewhat serious threat to the economy for California's future. So clearly there's a lot of recognition of potential downside. On the right side of the slide, you see a little bit of optimism. Almost, I won't say almost, a little shy of 50% of respondents believe that that efforts to reduce climate change could actually have a benefit of creating more jobs. And only 16% believed that that would result in fewer jobs, although it is also important to note that almost a fifth of folks weren't entirely certain what they thought was going to happen with respect to jobs, and that's an entirely fair position. So, you know, and I would put myself into the 44% who believe that there is an opportunity for efforts to reduce and adapt to climate change to create more jobs in not just our economy, but economies across the country and across the world. And that, I think, depends significantly on the level of proactiveness and opportunity that we can identify and pursue. So if you can go to the next slide, I believe we're right in the beginning stages of seeing the integration of climate resilience and economic development. And as I've been thinking about it and working on a number of different projects, I see distinctions and approaches that I've bucketed into these four broad categories. The two on the bottom left, number one and number two, the first approach is simply working to limit disasters' downsides. So this is emergency preparedness. This is disaster recovery. These are things that we know how to do with disasters already because we've always had disasters. And we're seeing more proactiveness about that. And in that, as an example for that, I've got a couple on the next slide that we'll get into. The next step up is the act of anticipating changes that you'll see in your region in order to limit economic risk. So this is still sort of coming at it from an economic downside perspective. Like, we're worried bad things are going to happen, and so let's try to make them as small as possible. Where I'm really encouraged to see action happening is in the next two stages. First of all, of building climate futures directly into economic development strategies, which is recognizing the reality and understanding that there are pathways to adapt economically to that reality. And then lastly, I would say we're not quite, I'm seeing glimpses of creating truly climate adaptive economies from an economic development and planning perspective. So on the next slide, the next slide talks a little bit more about each of these different and what distinguishes them from each other. So going back to the efforts of simply to limit disasters devastation, we have tools and we have practices that are well known and well understood with which we do this already. Local hazard mitigation planning documents, disaster preparedness, business resiliency planning, community resiliency planning. And in the community resiliency planning, as a California example, I will point to the recent California for All emergency preparedness effort that is being kicked off under Governor Newsom's administration this year, and which is focusing on emergency preparedness in multiple languages and in culturally appropriate contexts for the very diverse population of the state of California. Moving to the right, still thinking about the downside risks to the economy, but thinking about those in a more proactive way. We see examples of anticipating changes in order to limit future economic risks, and that can take the shape of a lot of physical activities, such as in our area, levee strengthening, improving forest management in order to limit wildfires, improving the efficiency of water use, and implementing cooling centers in advance of our climate becoming more like Arizona's. Moving again further to the right, is we get to the prospect of thinking about positive impacts on economies and embedding climate futures into economic development strategies. And the example that I would point to, again, here in the Sacramento region, is our local Council of Governments, Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG, which is updating its Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategies, in which is embedded our region's GHG reduction target overall. And what we're seeing happen in this round of that update is that regional economic development strategy, which is frankly why the Brookings report was commissioned in the first place a year and a half ago, as a grounding for our regional economic development strategy. That strategy is being implemented and integrated into the land use and transportation plan, which is what SACOG is developing. And so we're taking our forward look at our economic future, and we're taking our forward look at part of our climate future in terms of the greenhouse gas mitigation work that we need to do and how that will be embodied. And we're integrating those two. And I think that's an enormous step in the direction of thinking about positive impacts on our communities and our economies. And then fourth, and I must say I don't have an enormous number of examples to embody this one, but fourth would be to create truly climate adaptive economies and to shape economic and business strategies in order to not just to accommodate, but to seize opportunities in future climate needs and realities. And, you know, that could be anything from planning to reshape the crops that are grown in the greater Sacramento area because of climate change and what it will do to either water supply or temperature. So that was, you know, just as an example, that's the type of forward-looking, integrated, and optimistic work that I think we are getting ourselves in the direction of. So just to conclude, as the last slide, where I think we must head is that we need to break down the silos that distinguish right now economic development and climate resilience work. We need to break those down and integrate them together so that economic strategies can be fully interwoven with climate change awareness, mitigation, and adaptation. And we've got an example for how to break down silos in economic development planning already, because the divide that previously existed between community development and economic development are in the process of being dismantled. We see inclusive economic development strategies, not just in our region, but across the country. And that really is the integration of community needs and community strengths and weaknesses with economic opportunity. So we know how to break these silos down. We need to take the next step to pull that into the realm of climate and economic development. And I think the last slide is just my contact info. And with that, I'm all done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. We're going to move on now to Scott Hemmerling.
Good afternoon, and I'm glad everyone's on the phone here for our presentations. I'm kind of one-up Meg here, who went 2 days in the future. I'm apparently going 2 months in the past here, to back to when we all kind of presented on a panel back in Madison, Wisconsin. So I'm going to start with really talking about what's going on in coastal Louisiana, and I'll kick off with a little bit of background, which some of you may be aware of, but some may not. So if I want to head to the next slide. The first thing we really want to talk about is what's at risk. What's going on in coastal Louisiana? Next slide. So a lot of times we think about coastal land loss and what's going on in Louisiana. The maps we see on this slide show some of the, over time, how land loss has really grown in coastal Louisiana. Very regional. We see some small areas where there's land gain, but for the most part, especially as we see in that bright red, these are census blocks that over time have lost 50% of their land or more. So, a lot of the causes of this: sea level rise, subsidence, and we really have to start thinking about the coastal resources of Louisiana: environmental, urban, industrial, agricultural. There's vibrant communities across the coast of Louisiana that the nation really relies on, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But as the previous speakers noted, climate is changing, and the effects on some components are well studied. Understanding how all of these different stressors interact, especially in all of our geographies, but down in Louisiana, we do have drought. People don't think of drought here, but in 2005, when Katrina occurred, Louisiana was in a state of drought throughout much of the coast, actually. So drought, sea level rise, changing river flow, the impacts of rivers on our coastal ecosystems and the communities. These are all vital to understanding the coast of Louisiana. So next slide, please. But the previous map showed what was going on in the past, but in the future, things are anticipated to get much worse. The map we see here shows by 2060 where the inundation from a 100-year storm will be on communities. Obviously, as we get further inland, we still see some amount of flooding, even when we get far away from the Gulf Coast. Next slide, please. And in addition, that's the previous slide talked about, that a lot of that's nuisance flooding, but things like hurricanes. What we see here is in the 2000s, we looked at on the map on the left, all of the hurricane impacts that we kind of summarized for the decade of, Katrina, Rita, all of these. And we can see that coastal Louisiana, across the coast and stretching inland, there are a lot of tropical storm-related hazards. But one thing we really need to think about is who is in coastal Louisiana. The one map we see with the dots on it here show where a lot of the significant minority populations, for example, are. And you'll notice the green and blue are really identifying the flood risk. So the areas of green are the areas outside of the 100-year floodplain, which means everything that we don't see in green is special flood hazard area according to FEMA. So we can see that the communities in coastal Louisiana really kind of cling to these tenuous strings of land that stretch out along the bayous and some of the natural high ground. What we also see here is the green dots here show where we have significant Native American populations in the coast. So we do have a lot of vibrant communities that are down in the coast. So there's kind of this disconnect here, and a lot of people, and we hear this question quite often, well, why are people there? Why are people staying in harm's way? Why do we have these communities here, and why should we protect them? Next slide. Part of what we want to think through is the importance of coastal Louisiana for the rest of the United States. It's not just about, while we do have a rich cultural heritage in coastal Louisiana, it's also a working coast. A lot of the communities and the residents who reside in coastal Louisiana are there for what we like to call immovable industries. For example, oil and gas. Port Fourchon, which is kind of right in the middle of the coast and really one of the hot spots of land loss, provides 18% of the country's oil supply and services 90% of the Gulf of Mexico's deep water oil production. Over in southwest Louisiana, on the other side of the state, we have the Port of Lake Charles. The port provides 50,000 jobs, over $100 billion in private capital improvement projects at the Port of Lake Charles. So, in terms of oil and gas industry, coastal Louisiana is vital to the United States as a whole. Other industries would include the fisheries industries. While it doesn't make up as big an economic driver for community, we still provide a lot of the nation's seafood from the Gulf of Mexico. So next slide. Starting to think through why are the communities here and what impact will climate change have on them? What we see here is one of the quotes from one of the residents in Terrebonne Parish, one of our coastal counties. I would think the only thing that would make them leave is if they could not make a living shrimping, oystering, crabbing. Them not being able to make a living would probably be the only thing that would make them leave, because we've seen people's houses be devastated and they still rebuilt. As we're talking about resilience, that is one of the things we need to think about is, when do people come back? What makes them stay? And are we redeveloping in smart areas? So that's really kind of gets to the crux of the problem on how do we protect the coast of Louisiana. Next slide. So one thing that the state of Louisiana, and it began in 2007, but in 2012 really kind of became this really impressive modeling scientific effort called Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan, which is on a 5-year renewal cycle. We're actually moving, the 2017 report just came out, and now it's moving to a 6-year cycle. So 2023 will be the next round of the master plan. Next slide. And just for a little background on the master plan, it's a model-based effort which looks at numerous projects and looks at the interconnection of these projects, how projects can feed off of each other and really maximize, in the case of the goals of the state of Louisiana, and this is, again, the state's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority's plan, but it's how can we maximize the amount of land that's being built, and how can we protect the most amount of residents. So the master plan really is, you begin with a $50 billion budget, and what can we do with $50 billion to maximize land building and protection of communities? Next slide, please. So one thing, if we look at how the types of projects and how this total funding, if we reach $50 billion, 18.8 billion of that will be structural protection, such as levees and floodgates, things like that. But also another 17 billion would be needed to do marsh creation, because really without the marshes, that is really one of the speed bumps that prevent a lot of the storm surge from hitting our coastal communities. But there's also money in the master plan for non-structural protection, which is floodproofing of businesses, elevations of homes, and ultimately, it's not termed relocation, but voluntary acquisition. So there are some points when it's kind of recognized that no matter what we do, no matter what types of projects we can put in, this future environmental change and future climate change is really, there's some areas that just cannot be protected. But one thing we really want to stress here is kind of that $50 billion budget. That's a huge dollar amount. If we go to the next slide, a lot of the idea, the funding is not currently there. It'll keep building in the future, looking for new sources of funding. One of the primary sources of funding to really kick off the master plan and get some of these projects on the ground and really kickstarting the process came from the Deepwater Horizon funding. But if we look at the slide here, what we see, about $16 billion available for restoration, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you figure that's not even, that's a third of what is needed to actually fully implement the master plan. Next slide. So really, it's time for Louisiana and other coastal states and communities to start thinking, really, how can we start addressing these issues? In some cases, where the funding's simply not there from government sources, we need to start thinking about different ways that we can address this. So one thing that we're working on here at the Water Institute in partnership with a lot of the coastal industries is the Partnership for the Working Coast. If we go to the next slide. This really is, it's a partnership with, in this case, one of the major projects which I'll talk about is in Port Fourchon. And as I mentioned, that was the port where 90% of the offshore oil in the U.S. is serviced. Now, Port Fourchon has a lot of industries, a lot of companies that work there. They have a lot of residents who live, up Bayou Lafourche from the port. So they have their workers residing there. They have their infrastructure there. They have a lot going on, and there's a lot of incentive for them to preserve the coast. So we've developed the Partnership for the Working Coast, which brings together the Water Institute, some of our partners, and all of our partners at the port to really start thinking through how can we leverage funding to really maximize, bring together different industries that, they may compete on, the New York Stock Exchange stock values, but when it comes down to it, they're all co-located in the same area. And really, some of these problems are so large that industries need to kind of pool their resources together to see what can be done. This next slide, please. So one thing that the partnership is working on right now is there's an existing proposal in that, and what we see here in the map is the area around Port Fourchon. And there's some of the passes that lead out to the Gulf of Mexico. Bayou Lafourche kind of runs straight down through the center of it. But they need to deepen Bayou Lafourche, the flotation canal. They want to repurpose and do some of the rig repair facilities there. So ultimately, doing all of this, deepening the channel and refurbishing some of the areas is going to result in approximately 20 million cubic yards of fill that's going to be dredged out. Now, generally in the past, some of the commonly when you're dredging out some of these channels, this fill is just kind of thrown over the side of the levee. But one thing the port's interested in is, well, if we have this is a lot of material. Next slide. So how can we take this material that's coming from dredging the channel, which is something we need to do to keep our businesses up and running here? What can we do? How can we place this material in such a way that it can protect our infrastructure, protect our communities? Start thinking through, more broadly what we can do with this. For example, do we need to protect infrastructure? So we really bring in some of that modeling expertise and really bringing science to bear on this problem and looking at, from a modeling perspective, where is the best place that we can put this material. But there's also a community resilience component too, which, we need to think beyond just the models. We need to think about the communities and the people who live there who don't necessarily conform to what the models show us. So one thing that we're doing, and if you want to go to the next slide, is thinking through on the social return and investment. So there is going to be an investment made in transferring and moving the sediment around and putting it in the best place to provide the maximum benefit. But what these benefits are really come down to what the communities would like to see. What would provide community benefit? Are they more interested in restoring habitat for fisheries so they can sustain their fishing? So do we take this material and put it in some of the marsh area? Are they more interested in putting it in an area that can provide storm surge protection? Or are they more interested in taking this material, putting it someplace where you can create recreational or educational space? We don't know what this is, and the way to really get to that is through engaging directly with the communities and bringing them into the modeling process. If you go to the next slide, another quote that kind of brings some of this out. Have you ever been to Grand Isle, Louisiana? After every hurricane, it gets wiped out, but they come back with a fury, rebuilding. So I don't know what to tell you. Our people are different that way. We're crazy people. We defy the norm in a lot of ways. It depends on what they put a value on, whether or not they'd be willing. And I think that's really, and if we go to the next slide, I think that's really what do the communities put value on. So one thing, and we've piloted this working with the Restore the Earth Foundation, which is another nonprofit organization who their goal is to ultimately reforest and replant cypress all up and down the Mississippi River alluvial valley. And in 2016, we actually partnered with them to ground test their ecometrics model, which is built on the social return and investment platform. And really the idea was we go out and talk through qualitative and quantitative research, combining both of these. We go in, we talk to the communities, we figure out what will be the impacts. If we do this reforestation on your community, what will be the impacts? And in this case, we're thinking through some of these social impacts. And in the example of the Point of Chene Wildlife Management Area, there's a lot of Native American tribe members down there. And one thing, in speaking with the tribe members through this process, they said, the Gulf of Mexico is to the south of us, this reforestation is to the north of us. We're not getting any protection value out of this. If you wanted to protect us, you would have planted these cypress trees down here, and this is where that would have worked. But then through this process and talking to the tribe members, the conversation went to cypress baskets that their ancestors made that they have that are 100 years old, some that are in museums now, but that's a portion of their cultural heritage that has been lost. So through this conversation with the tribe members, they said, if the cypress forests come back, we will be able to bring back this part of our culture. So here's a case when we're talking about the social values, we have a stakeholder group that might not necessarily get the protection value, but they can get the cultural value of bringing the cypress back. And next slide. But one good thing that we can do with this, and using the ecometrics model that Restore the Earth developed and the qualitative research that feeds this, is we start placing dollar values to some of these social values. You bring in economists, and and I'm not an economist, I'm a geographer by training, but when we go through and talk about what is the dollar value of, or what's the cultural value of a cypress forest, there's economists who have gone through and said $11 an acre is, that is the cultural value of this forest. And there's a lot of science that goes into kind of this economics of it, but part of what Restore the Earth Foundation is interested in and why they want to see these dollar values attached to the social values that we identify through our research is they're trying to get funding from outside funding sources, whether it's oil and gas industries or any type of industry. They're trying to say, if you come in, for every dollar that you invest in this cypress reforestation, you get $14 back in social return. And that's something that really is appealing to some of these industries and people in their corporate social responsibility arms of some of these groups, and just in general, just their concern for the communities where a lot of their workers live. Next slide. So really, as I mentioned, in the case of the Point of Chene reforestation project, for every dollar invested, you get social and market value creation of $15.76 back. $14 of that is in social value, and then there's another $1.66 in direct market value, whether that's from blue carbon, green carbon, carbon markets, water trading. A lot of that goes into this. So I think this really is one of the important paths forward for a lot of the issues that we're seeing here. the government can't do it all. Even industry can't do it all. And it really is going to take this kind of partnership and understanding what these social values are, bringing together social scientists, economists, ecologists, modelers, everyone to kind of come together and work on these issues. If you go to the final slide, and a benefit of this is, or one of the things you can really look at once we start quantifying some of these things, you can see that there is a cost of inaction. There's a benefit of action. So really understanding from the market value, looking at, there's human capital, intellectual capital, manufactured capital, financial. There's a lot of benefits that come out of doing this. And it really, in order to really fund the future, we need to start thinking about innovative ways to bring funding in to address some of these issues. The final slide, and that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. So with that, we're going to move into some questions and answers. Just a reminder that if you want to submit a question, you can do that in the questions box that's on your GoToWebinar control panel. And I also wanted to acknowledge that a couple participants have sent in resources for our speakers, which we will make sure that they get after the webinar. Thank you for those. So the first question is for Mark, but I think everyone probably will want to take a shot at answering it. Meg had talked about integrating economic development with resilience. How are you balancing the issue of gentrification and livability for vulnerable populations in your resilience initiatives? Mark, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me better when the mute is off?
Here we go.
Yeah, is that better? Yeah, okay, good.
Now I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay, good to hear. No, I think actually all cities, I think probably in the last 2 years, have all been recognizing, and it's been a complete turnaround where they're all recognizing, oh, what have we done? Gentrification has been talked about for decades, but I think it's only really come to full recognition of how that, cities are investing their resources primarily in only certain parts of the population. All city services, a lot of the funding is going to is not actually going to the most vulnerable populations and the low-income residents. And so I'm really trying to look at how do we develop those communities, and how do we make sure that it doesn't just invest first in those communities and give them without gentrification, but look at how do we improve the quality of life for those individuals through training and education and through great pathways. Like, it's interesting, a lot of our transit investments are going to nice neighborhoods, but we should actually say, we should look at, okay, who has the highest percentage of zero-car households, and we should be definitely extending our transit routes and pathways to transit in those neighborhoods first, before, and investing in our sidewalks first in those communities. And so, definitely looking at how do we improve the quality of life for particularly the most vulnerable residents.
And I'll jump in too, if I can. As Mark was talking, I was thinking both about sort of California statewide policy, specifically with respect to the cap and trade program, which prioritizes cap and trade investments into disadvantaged and low-income communities, and has really driven, as a result, an increased focus on the needs and particular circumstances of those vulnerable populations, particularly because they are, in many cases, the same populations that are going to be most vulnerable first to some of the impacts of climate change. So statewide, we're fortunate in California to have a predisposition from a policy perspective toward behaving in appropriate and thoughtful ways toward on the topic of equity. And as a really specific example, I was at a meeting in a neighborhood in South Sacramento yesterday that is being led by it's named after a street, Franklin Boulevard Business Improvement District, which has some state funding to do some planning around a number of different areas, but they are focusing really significantly on transportation and the future of transportation, both transit and individual personal transportation, and the electrification of that, They have been able to implement well before many other parts of the city, microtransit shuttles on demand that are about to be converted from internal combustion engine shuttles to electric shuttles in the next, probably by the end of the summer. So, you know, an example of how, you know, sort of a reference back to state policy context, an example of how that's really being enacted and driven forward at the ground level in communities by members of those communities.
I think if I was going to add on a specific example, yeah, certainly, really, I think that probably brings home is one of the things is actually we looked at one of the low-income neighborhoods and the bike share. A lot of them didn't have credit cards to get bike share accounts, so we made a special city account that for $1 per year they could register as under the bike share and use the bike share for up to an hour a day. And so we put bike share stations in those communities for $1 a year. They get to use that bike share in those communities and neighborhoods, just, you know, as one specific example.
And I'll also mention, obviously, in Louisiana, the issue of environmental gentrification really comes up quite a bit. And we think about in New Orleans how rebuilding occurs, and, you know, are we displacing some low-income and minority residents and through the rebuilding process. But I'd also like to point out that this really is one of the concerns of a lot of the rural residents that you wouldn't really think about these types of gentrification issues. But when you get down to some of these small fishing villages down in coastal Louisiana, you know, one of their big concerns are, you know, national flood insurance program, flood insurance rates going up in the future. And, you know, a lot of the kind of the low income populations down there could really be stuck in a bind where they can't afford flood insurance. They can't afford a second mortgage. They can't afford to definitely can't afford to buy a second house. So they're kind of stuck in this position where no one will buy their house because no one wants to buy in this risky area. They can't sell, they can't move, they can't afford a second mortgage, they can't afford to elevate. So one of the big concerns down in the coast is that, and there are some signs of this already occurring, is that what you're going to end up seeing is the people who do want to move down to the coast or buy the property are going to be, you know, what they would say is, you know, the rich people up in Baton Rouge and New Orleans with their $1 million fishing camps coming in and buying up some of these houses, which is, for some communities, might be their only option. But the result is you will see this, you know, potentially in the future, that flood insurance rates could be a primary driver of population change. And as a result, you could see this environmental gentrification really occurring down in some of these smaller coastal communities.
Yeah, we also got a question that kind of follows on to this question. Well, it's closely related, about how the cheapest land is in places that are often at the most risk. So how do we ensure availability of that low income housing and make sure that vulnerable populations aren't moved to higher risk areas, not just out of where they're currently living?
Yeah, I'll give one example. We, you know, our housing department, we actually looked at how to have sort of Energy Star homes. We gave requirements for super efficient homes that were single family, but they were affordable housing, that how to build those affordable houses. So we contracted to get houses and looked for locations and things that were actually in different communities, they're called scattered sites, and actually found these really efficient homes so that they actually don't have, you know, the case of energy poverty where they can't afford air conditioning or things like that because the home's really inefficient and old. And then actually had these super efficient homes that were then were actually allowed that renters and owners as well can buy these homes that are affordable and make them available. And we really, I think that's a replication way, is actually allow opportunities for renting in all neighborhoods for affordable, if you and using some of the LICO qualifiers and things for affordability.
And in coastal Louisiana, I mean, there's the idea of a lot of the planning has been frowned upon by local residents in some cases, but in other cases we see kind of understanding this need. So there is that kind of balance here where we need to start thinking about planning and smart growth and things like that. And Louisiana's Office of Community Development over the last couple of years, have been working on their LA Safe program, which looks at a handful of parishes in Southeast Louisiana and working with Foundation for Louisiana, actually developing planning tools for these communities and planning reports for each of these counties or parishes, as we call them in Louisiana. But I think there is that kind of growing recognition here that through projects or through programs like LA Safe, that we need to start thinking about where we should and shouldn't be developing. Also, but we also have to recognize that there's a whole historical component to what we see going on, and some of the, a lot of the low-income communities are currently living in these areas now. So we have to kind of make that balance of, we have to recognize the historical processes that have resulted in some of the patterns we see today, but then try to also make sure we don't repeat these same things in the future.
Yeah, I think training. I think of things like it's not just one single answer, but you really need to look at all the issues facing many members of the community. And so, what about their health care, and what about addressing homelessness and training for low barrier jobs, and a number of cities are looking at training people who are currently low income to actually become citizen foresters and actually learn how to provide tree planting projects for them, to actually train them and give them a profession. And so trying to look at how can you address them, and certainly living wage, looking at how minimum wage and can actually pull them out of, so they can actually afford some of these places, increase affordability by actually making them more economically viable for everyone.
And I would just add that a lot of the communities in Northern California are currently in various stages of recovery and rebuilding. We've got the Sonoma and Napa fires, and particularly Santa Rosa from 2 years ago, and we've got Paradise and the whole Chico and Butte County area from 8 months ago. Those conversations about where and how to rebuild are underway. It's such a delicate emotional balance because of the trauma of the types of catastrophic events and the emotional attachment to home and to community and to place, that it can sometimes be a really difficult component to enter into a conversation with a group of people who are recovering from loss and difficulty like that.
Definitely. Thank you, Meg. So our next question is for Mark, but I also know that all three of you have been thinking about this. How much of your resilient community work has community leaders as part of the decision-making process on what those actions look like on the neighborhood level? So we can start with Mark and then go to Meg and Scott.
Yeah, no, and I think that, I think I've said this over and over, and I sort of don't want to say that it's just Phoenix doing this, because I think I certainly see this I just hear this over and over again, is that, cities in many ways have gone to the usual suspects and have the common people they go and engage with for decades. And they're the people, and they say, oh, we've done our Nobel oblige, we've gone out to the community and we talked to them, and really not talking to particularly, some of these more disadvantaged and vulnerable populations and communities. And yet cities have really been shocked as they've gone out and gone this, as they've required to be thinking about this and actually start having these conversations in communities. And we've been having them as well, and going out and having public dialogues within the communities. And it's interesting, you can have people from the universities that have a PhD in studying different things, but these people have a PhD in their community, and they know what it's like, they know where it floods, they know what they've tried. And so really talking to the local community members, it's actually been, a lot of our planning and development staff and others they're really amazed as they hear from the community. Like one thing was, we went out and we're talking with the community about heat ready and stuff, and people said, oh, that's really nice, that's good, you're taking care of it. They said, but what are we supposed to do if somebody actually falls down in the heat? We have no idea what to do. And so we actually said, oh, this is a real need we have. Like so we actually started training people in the community leaders and created a community leader handbook of all the different communities of how to actually train members of the community, how to respond in heat and flood, and how to help one another, and really start having these conversations. And I think it's been a very rich discussion that in many ways it's been a little bit of taboo to even talk about, have a conversation on race. And they go, oh no, we don't want to have these. These are pretty explosive conversations. And even looking at the panel across the screen here, we're a pretty white panel, but really recognizing how important it is to have these conversations, that what community members want is belonging. That's what we desire and long for most. And so we need to really have that conversation for people to feel belonging and part of our community. So, yeah.
And I'll jump in and say that I think there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity with the census because within each county, census managers are to different degrees of detail, but are building networks of connectivity, specifically intending to reach the hard to count populations. And in speaking to some of the folks in our region who are managing the census effort, the networks that they're building for this, frankly, one-time effort, one time every 10 years effort, are really rich and can reach through different channels and mechanisms or avenues into these hard to count populations, which in many cases are the same, the low income, the disadvantaged, the vulnerable populations that we think about when we're thinking about climate impacts. And so I think, the degree to which we can leverage connectivity that is being built maybe for different purposes, but to find and speak with the same types of populations, that's better for everybody. It's frankly, it's particularly good for the folks who we're wanting to engage with and wanting to talk to. The other example I would cite is we've got a local lung health nonprofit in our region called Breathe California Sacramento region. And they do some work under contract to our air quality management district, which has an EV car sharing, a free EV car sharing program in public housing properties. And they also have a Clean Cars for All program, which is a car scrap and replace program. And they're in the design phase of the Clean Cars for All. And so Breathe has been going out and conducting focus group conversations in specifically targeted communities to try to understand how best to design this Clean Cars for All program so it can be most effective to the largest number of folks. And, in putting these focus groups together, obviously they are meeting in the communities at the times that are designated as most productive by the host. And it's a host individual who is hosting these conversations in his or her home. And Breathe is compensating not just the host, but also the participants for their time and frankly, for the expertise and the insight that they're contributing. So I think, obviously, as I said, California's cap and trade context is driving appropriately a lot of interest and importance of engaging in vulnerable communities. And it's important to think about how best to do that.
Yeah, and I'll
sorry, I just lost all my video, so I'm not sure if I lost everybody, but now I can hear somebody, so I'm not all the way gone.
And I'll just
on, but we just oh no, I can see you. Okay, you're good.
Yeah, I'll just mirror what Mark and Meg both said, that it's really about directly engaging with the communities, and we can't even no matter what type of scientist you are, you can't elevate your knowledge above the local knowledge that communities have, because that expertise and insights that Meg had, this is important data that we need to bring into everything we're doing. I mean, these, like I said, they are local knowledge experts, and we've done things with bringing our modelers, our flood modelers, into the communities and meeting over several months with community members to kind of deconstruct and rebuild some of these H&H models, these hydrologic models, with the community, so they have full buy-in on what the models look like, so they can trust the science. In terms of resilience, we're working on developing a resilience index now, but one of the problems that a lot of people have with resilience indices is that they're too general, too vague. You bring your census data in and you map out an entire coast. But one thing we're doing is through community engagement, recognizing that resilience is experienced differently in an urban neighborhood versus a rural community. Even in a rural community, a rural agricultural community will experience resilience differently than a rural fishing community. So I think understanding those differences, and you can only understand that through engaging with community members, but then feeding that knowledge back into our models and the things that we do to make sure that this data is usable by the people who are making decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thanks, all of you.
If I could just comment, I think one thing that Scott just said was kind of interesting, and I think it's a really important concept to get across here, and that, when you talk about sustainability that's normative, and it's meaning that it's talking about the way things ought to be. But resilience is very much a snapshot in time of the way things are and the way things are today. So it's not a like, oh, we've achieved resilience. It just is, you can actually become more and less resilient over time as things and as your community evolves. So it's kind of how you are today. And so I think it's really important. It's a constant looking at what's happening with our climate, what's happening with our community, and what are the issues, and are we addressing them effectively? Are we letting the community voice be heard? So I think that's an important feature, that resilience is very much something that constantly needs to be at the forefront to continue to move toward.
Thanks, Mark. So we have many more questions in the queue, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But we have a few that ask about different elements of funding. So I'm going to ask kind of a multi-part question, and perhaps Meg could start with this one. So one of the questions about how much cities are reliant on federal grants and funding to invest to support these initiatives. And then Meg, someone had sent in a question that was specifically responding to you mentioning the role of private-public partnerships. So thinking a little more about how that the role of P3s can grow within resilience while making sure that community development objectives and economic development and equity objectives are all accomplished in that work. And then, just if you have any other thoughts on how to, creatively fund some of these resilience initiatives. So let's start with Meg.
I had to get myself off mute. So those are some pretty big questions. And I think tackling the one about public-private partnerships and the value that they can bring while still honoring and respecting community development objectives is a really good topic. Frankly, I believe that one of the greatest contributions of the public sector in a public-private partnership is that of keeping front of mind the community's priorities, so that whatever the scope of work is that the public-private partnership is endeavoring to do, part of the role of the public entity is to represent the public and the priorities of the public as they're understood, and make sure that the project keeps pulling back to that fundamental public need that was identified, that presumably this partnership is pursuing. The private side of a public-private partnership, I think, brings a lot of strength, particularly as it ties back to the potential for funding and financing. Because one of the, again, I'm thankful to be in the state of California, where we have a great deal of state level conviction about climate action and state level funding to enable climate action. and even so, it's absolutely imperative that we, the collective we, better activate the private markets, the private capital markets, to help find ways to invest in and support the type of work that we all need to be able to get done in the next years. And so in a public-private partnership, I think, that's, depending who the partners are, but that's one of the assets or attributes that I think a private sector partner group can bring. I don't know if that's entirely responsive, but there's my best shot.
Yeah, thanks. You can mention parts of it.
Yeah, I did mention the green bond, where actually pretty attractive rates where investors, impact investors in particularly, are wanting to invest in these, and angel donors are wanting to see it. And we surveyed our community, and actually over 50% of people said they'd be willing to donate to a tree planting campaign. That people really do like that. And we actually, in the same survey, 75% of people said they'd be willing to pay $15 more per month on their energy bill to get 100% renewable energy. And so just that people are saying, no, we're willing to do this. Like, just give us a pathway to do that. And how, when we met with our businesses, and when we said, look, 92% of people said they crossed the street in Phoenix in the summer in order to walk in the shade. We said, hey, do you want to walk along front of your business? Hey, create shade out front. And so, it's really interesting that businesses are eager to support and join in. And I think we just really need to make it, just provide an easy way for that to happen.
Thanks. Scott, did you have any thoughts?
No, I really don't have much to add to that besides what's been said. It's really, businesses are, there is a need for business to start with their doing good for the communities. And, I think we kind of have to, whatever the reason, they are responsive to their shareholders and everything. But ultimately, if we can find a way to maximize the utility to everyone involved, I think that's where it becomes important. And I think it was Meg who said the public, having a public entity in there to represent the public is vital to this, to make sure that we're not just doing a P2 where the public's not involved and it is just protecting infrastructure. But if we can protect infrastructure and protect communities at the same time, that's where really we need someone to speak for the public in these situations.
Thanks. So we have just a couple minutes, and I'm going to ask just one more question that we can all just briefly discuss. Part of it is a clarifying question for Scott about the social return on investment formula that you showed in your slides. If that is a Louisiana specific activity. And then if you could talk more on any of those methods to quantify the economic benefits of resilience initiatives, and also if Mark and Meg have had any experience with that. And I just wanted to point out that in those briefs on resilience strategies for communities that I mentioned in the beginning, we do have some methodology for quantifying economic benefits from different strategies. So you also should look at C2ES's resource library and check those out. But yeah, Scott, if you could respond to that.
Well, so far, and I mentioned we've piloted it in 2 communities in Louisiana, and again, using the ecometrics model that Restore the Earth developed. It's actually based on there's a social return on investment method that an organization out of the UK, Social Value International, that they kind of developed this social return on investment method, and we've expanded it and included environmental components in it. But that's kind of the framework of this, is that Social Value International framework, and then we added an environmental component to it. And it's really, the method is reliant, it's based on community engagement first. So the first thing you do is identify who your potential stakeholders might be, and you have to think broadly. In the case of this wildlife management area where we did the cypress reforestation, this is on the Mississippi River flyway where there's a lot of the waterfowl migrate over this area. So we had to include Ducks Unlimited here, even though they don't reside directly adjacent to this. They are a stakeholder who could be impacted by this. So thinking through those, who are the stakeholders, bringing them in, and really understanding what what are the inputs that go into this project in terms of finance, labor, energy? What do people put in? Thought processes. What goes in? What are the outputs and outcomes they get back? And then kind of tying it to the economic literature. And it's, so far with Restore the Earth, and we have a few, looking to expand it, but we've done 2 in Louisiana at the Pointe aux Chênes Wildlife Management Area, kind of down on the coast, where there was a current reforestation that was just kicking off. And then we went further up near the Louisiana-Arkansas border, near one of the national wildlife refuges up there, where they did a cypress reforestation 10 years earlier. And this one, the difference between the two was in Louisiana, they put it in the wildlife management area. The North Louisiana one, they actually bought some of the land around the refuge, which displaced some of the tenant farmers who are on there. So there we have this negative, which had to be taken into account. So those are the 2 where we've piloted it. We're getting ready to hopefully kick off another one. We're actually moving over into Georgia and looking at the impacts of converting agricultural land to basically a solar farm. So what are the social benefits to the community of that? And that's one that hasn't kicked off. It hasn't, but that's probably, we are looking to kind of take the method and broadly think through, other types of issues that we could address with it.
Thanks. Mark or Meg, did you have any quick thoughts?
Yeah, I see we're out of time, but I did want to say, if people just Google, it's really interesting actually, donut economics. And there's some great online videos and YouTubes of what is donut economics. And it really looks at, instead of, it just is a different way of thinking than just, relying 100% on economy as, and economic growth as the factor, which actually is not sustainable. So donut economics, it's a lot of fun. It's a cool area to look into.
I can't top that.
I think that's a good way to to wrap this up. Yeah, so we're all out of time. Thank you to our speakers, Mark Hartman, Meg Arnold, and Scott Hemmerling. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining the webinar and for all of your questions and your participation. We have a whole list of our upcoming webinars on the C2ES website. So please register for future webinars, and we'll see you at those. So thanks everyone. Have a great day.